I learned most about myself in this process. I have read and taught about regulating emotions, but doing it is actually quite tricky. How would you begin the shift process within a team? I don't know when Cooper asked that, but it's definitely part of.
So if I might respond there, Matt, I just get going. I mean, when should we start doing anything? Just get a conversation going, and for me, it starts with, well, when you are stuck in a negative emotional state, what do you do now? I mean, what are your current techniques? And you'll find it's a list of those things. Well, I tried to clear my head, go for a walk, or I kicked the cat or something. I mean, everybody does something, right? So then go, well, look, actually, if we were to deconstruct and analyze those somethings that we all do and try and look for the active ingredient, when it works, why does it work? And so just get a conversation going with a team about what are your current strategies and how effective are they? And most strategies have hung around over the years because they work occasionally. And so say, well, actually, why don't we all just try this? Because we've all got hearts and none of us have all got cats or dogs or the ability to walk outside during the pandemic. But we've all got hearts and we can all focus on our hearts. So it's something that we can all do wherever we live, whatever our living circumstances, whatever classroom we're in, whatever staff room we're in, we can all do it. So just encourage people and just start the conversation. That would be my encouragement there.
And I've had some feedback from that midweek, Alan, around how do I start if I'm a middle manager or a middle leader, and my senior leader's not on top of this and feels it's a bit wishy-washy.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So first rule of emotional regulation, it's not about them. It's about you. So stop trying to change everybody else. First you, then them. So, and you see, when we did the work in schools, way back when, there's a very strong kind of passionate desire amongst teachers, particularly to help the children. And you also see it in many caring professions. They think and they're identified, my role here is to help others, which it is, but you can't help others if you don't first help yourself. So, we'll encourage you, don't worry about anybody else in the world. Start with you. And if you shift your own emotional state, that will clear your mind and you'll come up with a better way forward with that other person who's being tricky or difficult. So you first, then them. So these are skills to practice for yourself. And then once you've got the clarity, you've got control of your own emotional state, you're much more likely to figure out, how do I trigger this senior member of staff, or how do I come up with a way of talking, a way of telling a story, or a way of engaging with them that might shift them? So I'd worry less about them in the early stages. Sort yourself out first, get really good at that, and maybe role model it. Maybe a bit that will inspire them because they'll see the shift in you. You seem to be much calmer, much more at ease with yourself. That might trigger their curiosity. So again, worry less about them, focus on yourself first is what I'd say to that.
Dave, did you pick up?
We've been asked a very interesting one, Matt, on the Q&A. So Elizabeth Koski is asking us, looking at leadership character strengths, what do you both think your top skills are? Intro. Do you want to start?
Is that for myself or Alan? That's
you go, Matt.
I'm not sure. Maybe we can go all three.
So myself and Dave have come up with words around the one word that would describe us best. So for me, it's unlock. So again, it's unlocking the potential of others. That very much is my purpose.
Dave, do you want to say something?
For me, I'd say, yeah, I think an intuition to get behind what's really going on in the moment. And whether that's a conversation that's happening and actually being able to intuit that there's more behind this conversation than the people are saying, or in a meeting or in an environment. So just having those antennae that's able to sort of detect what isn't being said and what isn't being communicated, I think is a skill that's helped me throughout my whole life.
And if I may, I mean, I'd certainly agree with both of you. Matt's got an incredible ability to unlock the potential in others, and Dave is very intuitive. I'd like to answer questions slightly differently because what I think is really important here is not what my strengths are, or frankly anybody's strengths are, but what level of maturity we operate with. Because if you look at the leadership literature, everybody's got a different set of strengths, and there isn't one set of strengths, frankly, that predicts success. Everybody's got a different set of strengths, whether it's intuition or the ability to unlock, and the source of our magic. But what excites me is what level of maturity, and if we can unlock more levels of maturity, then people have a much greater level of fulfillment, much more effective in their life. So it's a bit like, you can describe the strengths of a 6-year-old. But what we're trying to do is to enable that human being to mature to a 12-year-old, to an 18-year-old, to a 24-year-old, to a 32-year-old. So for me, it's less about the strengths that you've got. That's not the game changer. It's more about what level of maturity or sophistication you're operating from.
7:30.
Sorry, somebody's got their microphone on and is talking there. Are you all right just to mute, unless you've got a question?
I've muted somebody who
Speaking
was
of
not
that, some people are open without their mute button on. So does anyone have a question there?
Somebody asked a question I saw about that. Could your shift skill be applied to an overactive brain when trying to sleep? Well, there's quite a few techniques really that you need to train, because most bright people do have overactive brains. And so one of the things, I wouldn't necessarily use the shift skill at that moment. One of the things I found very useful is to try and anchor yourself in the here and now. So when your mind is racing, and particularly if you've got a lot on your mind, or particularly anxious or worried, you wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and your mind starts racing. And as soon as you start noticing your mind's racing, you start wrestling with it and fighting with the racing mind, trying to stop it. So if you shift your attention to something real immediate, like how are your knees touching each other? How are your ankles touching each other? How's the duvet over your shoulder? How does the pillow? And you just keep rotating round relatively dull bits of information, and just keep moving your attention to the here and now and anchoring in the here and now. If you add that together with slowing your breathing down significantly, and getting the temperature right, because you need to go back to sleep, you need to drop your temperature by about 2 degrees C. So if you shove a leg outside the duvet, slow your breathing right down and anchor your attention in the here and now, and just keep moving around relatively dull bits of information, you might find you'll drop back off to sleep much more easily, rather than trying to deliberately turn on a positive emotion and wrestling with it. So it's a slightly different approach than a full shift skill.
Just one more, Alan, that's just come in. Will Complete be working in education in the future? So Krupa's also in Shaftesbury High School. And so Krupa, you know that I've been working with you and Matt for the last 9 months, but maybe Alan, you want to say something about the question.
The purpose of the company is to develop enlightened leaders in all walks of life, because we think suffering flows from poor decision making, of well-intentioned people, but they're seeing a partial picture. So whilst most of our work is with in the corporate space with multinational companies, we do, and we're already beginning to do some work in education, like we did 10 years ago. Is we're starting that up again, and we work with professional athletes, whether they're Olympic athletes or professional sports people. We're starting even to do a little bit of work in the political sphere. So enlightened leaders in all walks of life, because it's a game changer. So whoever you are, whatever you're doing, learning to regulate your emotion as the start point is a game changer in your life. So we're very happy to have any teachers reach out to us, and I'm sure Matt and Dave will be happy to respond to you and see what we can do to help you. And we're constantly developing more resources that will be coming into the schools, like the app and various other resources. But certainly Dave and Matt can help support you. So just encourage anybody who's interested in getting more information, maybe more support, just reach out to us and we'll respond to you.
Simon's put down here, can you help me? How can I maintain a positive outlook when the news is frightening and the outlook is not clear?
It's a challenge, is the simple answer to that. But if you look at the research on hardiness, that sort of resilience, there's two paths that lie ahead. One is a path that leads to poor health, poor performance, and ongoing problems. When the stress gets really bad, it takes you down to things like PTSD or permanent anxiety, permanent depression. But interestingly, there is another path. So rather than sort of a PTSD type scenario, there's a PTG, post-traumatic growth. And it's that path that we encourage people to go down, which is start practicing some of the things that Dave and Matt and I shared with you this evening. And being able to, first of all, regulate your emotion. But the ultimate game changer is something slightly deeper, which is trying to find meaning in the crisis. And Viktor Frankl wrote a beautiful book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor. And you'll see this in many people who've suffered terrible trauma, and they find some meaning in it. And certainly when I was doctoring, I've had so many patients over the years say, do you know what, that cancer diagnosis was the best thing, that heart attack was the best thing that ever happened. And you think that's sort of weird that people say such things, but it woke them up and it caused them to change their life and to make some significant positive change. And that's the meaning making in the trauma. But the first step is this emotional regulation that we've been sharing with you. But ultimately, that enables you to go into the deepest, darkest caves of who you are and actually make meaning out of the crisis. And if you can get to that, what will we have learned from this pandemic as a species? Will humanity make meaning out of this terrible scenario? And if we can do that, we'll all be the better for it. So emotional regulation first, and then meaning making second.
Agreed.
And it is about practice, and it isn't easy. As Alan said, it's not easy. None of the things we share with you are quick fixes. It does need practice. And I think I shared last week that I'd had a horrible morning because I'd read the papers all morning, and I've got a daughter who's a nurse, and I just got myself into this really sort of scared, anxious state. And I did I went through the steps. I shifted. And I sat down and I practiced the breathe skill. And I practiced moving my emotion. Whereas in the past, I would have probably gone to binge eat some chocolate out of the fridge or something else. And that, that doesn't ever go away, that sort of response in me. So you have to keep practicing. And the more you practice, the better you get at it and the more able you are to do it.
Which is why we're called practitioners, not coaches, right? So because even today, and I've been teaching this video, I practice every day. And there's this, we are what we practice. If we practice feeling panicky, we get good at it. If we practice feeling worried, we get good at that too. But the good news is if we practice feeling optimistic, if we practice feeling appreciation, we can get really good at that too. And appreciation is a very powerful, very simple, but very powerful emotion, which most human beings, it's down the sort of shallow end of the 17,000 positive emotions it's possible to feel. Appreciation would be down the shallow end. Just simple appreciation for the fact that we can breathe in and out. Just simple appreciation that our eyes work for most of us. Just simple appreciation, the fact that our fingers, and we've got dexterity. So just simple practice of appreciation can make a radical difference.
So Helen's touched back into the SLT point here and said, how would you instigate conversations amongst your SLT to facilitate us to discuss emotions, especially under current working remote practices and rising pressure over schools reopening? Dave, is that an answer for coming week? Because I think we're moving on to that in a couple.
We are talking but again, I think worth saying, I mean, if you look, Matt, at how you did this at your school. So again, start with awareness. And what Matt did was bring a list of, I think it was 30 or 50 or 80, the sort of most common emotions, and had that on his board and talked about it in his senior leadership team, and actually encouraged people to talk about how they were feeling, which at the beginning is really weird, but the more you do it, the more people get used to it. And so, start with awareness and just build it to make it completely because I'm sure schools are like many businesses, you know, talking about your feelings is not something we're normally encouraged to do. And particularly, you know, men even more than women are quite often brought up not to express your feelings. So just getting it out there, talking about it, sharing it, and then building your skills as you go through, building breathe into, you know, why don't you start a meeting with a couple of minutes of the breathe skill? Very weird first time you do it, but after you've done it a few times, it starts to become more and more natural.
I think we found changes as well in the dynamics with certain members of staff already on that boat, and we found that sort of one-to-one, small groups, starting it not necessarily with your whole team, but can you start it in smaller groups and then bring it together with that team when you have that tipping point as well. I mean, not to resist doing it and hold off, but you can really just if you're getting, it's like anything with teaching, the more you teach it, the better you get. So the more you can practice this with colleagues, if you don't have that confidence to step into your whole SLT team to do this, practice with different members and build up that culture.
And if I can add in, a few people have been talking about this, growing through what you go through. Now, that is entirely possible, but it doesn't necessarily follow. And I remember when I was doctoring, I'd often been in the room when a patient had taken their last breath. And it's really quite a profound moment. And I'd be stood there with another colleague. So we'd be going through the exact same experience. And when that happened, it's so profound. I'd have to stay there for 10 minutes and just sort of process it all and sort of make sense of it. But I could be stood next to somebody else who went through the exact same experience and learned nothing. They'd go, oh, patient's died. Oh, right. Okay, lunch. And then they'd clear off to lunch. And I'd have to stay there for 10 minutes. So whilst it's entirely possible to grow through what you go through, that doesn't happen necessarily. It's not a given. And so I honestly believe that in order to grow through what you go through, to mine out the growth in any experience, you have to pay attention. You have to manage your emotion in the moment and then try and make meaning out of that moment, even if that moment's a profound moment, like somebody passing away. So it doesn't necessarily follow just because you go through a lot of things, you learn much and you develop. You don't necessarily learn and develop. So what we're trying to do is to try and how do you make sure that whatever you go through does result in growth? Because humanity might go through a pandemic. We went through the global financial crisis, but we didn't grow much as a result. Nothing much changed. So the hope, through COVID is it will wake more people up and we will grow up as a result. But that's the big question, will it? And so part of what we're sharing, Matt, Dave, myself, is trying to ensure that people do grow through what they go through.
And I know we haven't mapped out the values and egos, Dave, into the 6 weeks, but I think if we can definitely build it in somewhere, definitely one of the most profound pieces of reading that I've come across around adult development. And Alan, it's not hugely spoken around in leadership circles yet.
It's probably the number one trend in leadership but not many people have woken up to it because we've had 40, 50 years of description of strengths and personality and all of that type of stuff. And an obsession with learning, learning organizations and learning curves. And people are only really in the last 10 years waking up to the fact that learning is only 20% of the puzzle, 80% is in the application of that learning to affect positive change, where the learning becomes development. So if you can effectively apply what you've learned, you can develop. And so there's a notion in the States called a DDO, a deliberately developmental organization. So schools and organizations need to put development at the heart. And by development, I don't just mean the acquisition of another skill. I mean changing the nature of who you are, maturing as a human being, not just acquiring more skills. That's like a horizontal phenomena. The maturation, the increased sophistication is a vertical phenomena, and horizontal is very different from vertical. So this vertical development, this increased depth and altitude is what is the game changer. So organizations are beginning to wake up, whether it's schools or businesses or political parties are beginning to wake up. And we hope that the pandemic will wake more people up. Because the exciting thing is that when you do develop vertically, when you do move up a level, things come online that didn't even exist at the previous level. You know, awarenesses and understandings and levels of compassion and sensitivity, you know, step change as you move up with every new level that you unlock.
And each line supports the other.
Correct.
Yeah. So Nazi has also asked, is there any evidence that diet can impact emotional regulation?
Oh, without doubt. And in fact, it's a hugely interesting area looking at the microbiome, which is the bacteria in your gut and how that affects mood. And we're really only at the beginnings of an entire explosion and understanding. I think within 20 years, we'll all be analyzing the bacterial kind of flora and fauna in our guts and adjusting our diet accordingly, because there's no doubt that it can change mood. I mean, one of my 4 sons is profoundly autistic, and he was gluten intolerant when he was much younger. And if you gave him a piece of bread, it was like, he was on some kind of incredible cocaine high. I mean, he was bouncing around the room and on the ceiling almost. So there's no doubt that nutrition can change mood. But for most people, what I'd say about nutrition and exercise, what we call the 3 big E's: exercise, eating, and emotions. So we might be exercise 2 or 3 times a week if we're good. We eat maybe 3 or 4 times a day. But emotions are happening every single second of every single day. So we think that's really the elephant in the room, and it's the least discussed. So if you go to your doctor, he will give you advice possibly about your diet. He'll give you encouragement to go to the gym. But what they rarely talk about is the emotional regulation piece, and that's the elephant in the room. So I'd really encourage people, of course, we need to eat better and eat well and all of that, and we need to get regular exercise. But get a grip of the emotions, because it's easy once you start practicing to start to move the dial pretty quickly. So I think that's the big one as far as I'm concerned.
And Elizabeth's just touched on do you think that we are all living through the stages of PTSD?
No, put simply. I mean, some people, will get into an emotional state, whether it's on the change curve or the stages of PTSD or whatever it is, and get stuck at that first step. Some people, won't go there at all. So I think everybody's having a very different experience. And so therefore, we're trying to give you sort of skills that will help you navigate whatever your experience. Skills, whether you're got stuck on the first step of PTSD or the sort of cycle of grief or the change curve or whatever sort of process you're going through, that will help you navigate wherever you are on your journey, whether you're stuck on the planet of anxiety or depression or panic or worry or boredom or disinterest. These are skills that can help you navigate the universe of emotions, whichever planet you are.
And I think that's one of the main things that really drew me to complete in the first place, was that HRV diagnostic. And one of my long-term goals is to bring that HRV diagnostic into education. How are we looking at the capacity of our young people to develop and manage their emotions?
Well, you might get your wish sooner than you think, Matt, because that's going to be part of the new app. And we saw when we did the work many years ago, my wife and I, in the inner city schools in Southampton, the first time we ever went in was we did a demonstration about brain shutdown under pressure with an 8-year-old who was causing trouble, and the head had to grab that child, and he brought them into the meeting. And we were having a meeting with the SLT of that school. And he brought this child who'd just been having a fight in one of the lessons, and he basically frog marched him into the SLT meeting and threw this child at me on the basis of, look, you're clever, you fix him. And he threw this child at me. And so we plugged him into the biofeedback kit, showed him live his biology, and then very quickly taught him how to regulate his breathing in the way that you guys have shared. And literally, I kid you not, in about a minute, he got his biology under control. And this was a child who was the youngest of 5 kids. His siblings used to pick on him and beat him up. His dad was in prison. He was considered a troublemaker in the school. All of his peers hated him, and none of his life was working. And he discovered a very important lesson the morning I saw him, that there was one thing that was working in his life, and it turned out it was him. And so he learned how to control his own biology that morning. And in fact, once he generated some coherence in his biology, and I'd noticed that on the biofeedback kit, I started to lavish some praise on him. I said, "Oh my goodness, I've never seen a child get control of his biology this quickly. You must have done this before, Toby." I haven't done this before. And I said, no, it's a genius. I don't know whether the head really, he's got a genius in his school. You must be a genius. I've never seen a child get control that quickly before. You're clearly a genius. And then the other SLT members realized what I was up to, sort of lavishing this child with praise. So another teacher said, "Oh, maybe we could give him a certificate." And another teacher said, "Yes, with a big gold star." And so Toby, who came in sort of infused with anger and rage and frustration, literally in 4 or 5 minutes, we'd shifted him to a state of coherence and then a state of excitement and a state of exuberance. And he went out of that meeting room 10 foot tall. So he learned that lesson in literally about 5 minutes. In life where nothing was going right, he discovered there was one thing that was going right. There was one thing that he could control. And it turned out it was him. So he learned that in 5 minutes. So we will be bringing the HRV back into schools, and we would hope that might be within the next month or two. Is you'll see that on the new version of the app.
And the visual version of being able to watch that just explains so much to the students without necessarily having the full understanding of every piece of theory. Just being able to see that map out on the screen as they're experiencing it and as that state changes.
I see somebody said that emotional intelligence could be a module during teacher training program, and I totally agree, because you know what, it's quite emotional in schools from what I've observed. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to perform for the students and the teachers and the staff and all the staff, and emotions come up all the time when you're under that kind of performance pressure. So it really is a game changer, in my view, for all human beings, but particularly for children and teachers, to be able to control their emotional state. And by control, I don't mean suppress. You don't become robotic and lacking in emotional kind of contrast and valence. It's the ability to regulate, to be able to switch from one emotional state to another. And there are 34,000 emotions to choose from. There's a whole universe of emotions. So it's that textured, subtle, beautiful nuance that we can all develop as human beings, whether we're teachers or business people or children or whoever we are. We can all cultivate a much greater level of emotional awareness and emotional literacy, emotional regulation, and ultimately have a much more fulfilling life as a result.
So my final question, Alan, you're going to redesign education, the classroom, the setting. What does it look like to you?
Well, I'm hoping you're going to tell me that, Matt. You're the educational genius. I'm a guy in the back shed tinkering with stuff and trying to pass it to clever people like yourself to take it into the field. So I think you'd probably be better placed, but certainly at the heart of it, it's children and adults. I'll leave you with one final story, regulating their emotion better. When we did the school's work a few years ago, we did the first term was teaching the teachers. The second term was teaching the teachers how to teach the children. And the third term was working with the children. And we saw that actually, as the teachers started to teach these skills to the children, these children were going home and having an impact on their family life. And there's many of these kids were of parents who themselves had been school failures. And I remember this one particular parent coming in for the first time ever into a school, never been to a parents' evening, never turned up to any school activity. And he came in one day, this big gruff guy from this sort of sink estate. "What have you done to my son?" We're thinking, "Oh goodness, what's happened?" "What do you mean, what have we done to your son?" "Well, he seems so kind of relaxed, and he used to be really agitated, almost ADHD, and he's just so sort of unflustered now. What have you been doing to him?" And actually, it was causing parents to come in for the very first time. So I think part of the answer to the schools of the future is where we empower communities with emotional regulation of children and adults. And as we become better emotionally regulated, we can build better relationships with each other. And I think we can all benefit from that.
Thank you, Alan. I think I just have to draw on that final point and say we're at a position in which we have the ultimate opportunity to connect with parents. We are digitally interacting with students and parents on a daily basis with this new homeschooling arrangement that a lot of schools across the country have. And dovetailed with that is an emotional need to regulate, and for students and parents alike to be able to understand how to do that. So I think that opportunity to educate both students and parents at this point is a real way of finding some meaning in the middle of COVID. So thank you so much, Alan, for coming on this week. I think I'm going to have to put up both halves of the episode because the second half was as riveting as the first. Thank you, Dave, as ever, for your contribution as well. And you have been part of Beneath the Waves.